it's like a fundraiser, $14,000, guys. If it's in your possibilities to donate some money, I think that'd be a very noble cause to donate. Yeah, NATO and Russia. Okay, perfect.
You might be wondering, how did it come to this? How, even after the USSR fell, did Russia go down such a different path than NATO?
Yeah.
Was there ever perhaps some possibility that these...
It's a pretty good question, though, and when we were talking about Ukraine, I was like, I don't think it's smart for Russia to be so aggressive against NATO. I think it'd be better for the Russian people and the Russian country as a whole to just be closer to NATO. It's not the Cold War anymore.
After the end of the Cold War,
there's no reason for that.
Together in peace, because apparently Putin seems to
dumb.
think so, or at least he says so. His current track record with the truth isn't the best, by the way.
You really think someone would do that?
Putin says Russia wanted to join NATO, but NATO didn't let them. Is there truth to this?
Oh, well,
the
maybe
answer
there's
to
some
why
truth.
Russia didn't join NATO is a story about a former superpower rebuilding itself from the ground up. How Russia, or at least the Duma and Putin, viewed their status in regards to the West. So first, the question we're all asking. When it comes to this whole situation, who's to blame for this? It's Putin. 100%. This was all Putin. Even if NATO had done some bad things, even if Russia had some fair points about their expansion, even if NATO took over Ukraine, like Putin says, you still can't invade others. Like, it was bad when the US did it in Iraq. It's even worse when Putin does it now. 1991.
I agree,
the fall of the
100%.
Russia is weak and wants assurance from the US and NATO that they wouldn't spread east of Germany. Eastern Europe could be like a neutral ground, and the United States informally agreed. Or, well, George H.W. Bush.
And that's another thing. It's an informal agreement. It's not they signed a treaty, right? So it's just informal.
Verbally.
Bar. We can't show any weakness in front of the Russians.
This was never an actual written agreement. It was just an understanding. Oh, also, I was lying. This agreement wasn't made with Russia after the fall of the USSR, but before, with Gorbachev. The importance of this agreement really depends on who you ask. For avid Russian supporters, this was a legitimate, sometimes legal agreement that NATO promised and then broke. For NATO, their promise not to move east was an informal verbal agreement that doesn't matter. Throughout the last century, there have been multiple...
Plus, it was, if we're going to look at technicalities, it was an agreement made with the Soviet Union, not Russia. Technically very separate, very different entities.
Discussions between NATO and the Russians over their
I don't know about that,
relationship
Chief.
with NATO. The first one, at least of note, was in 1990, where the United States agreed not to move east into East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR, though weakened, was still a prominent power, and NATO verbally agreed that they would never move in to Germany. And then the Soviets collapsed. Now, when talking about how important these promises were to the Soviets, we will never really know. Even Gorbachev flip-flops on how important these assurances actually were. What's more interesting is the constant...
Not
of the
now, I don't think, but...
CSCE. Never heard of it? It's because it never really panned out like it was truly planned. Whether or not any of this was true or just bluster, this talk of a united umbrella was seen as a viable possibility in the early 90s, before the USSR even fell. This is what Gorbachev and the Russians heard. Russia, at least if the Soviets fell, would be joining a united Europe. And then Clinton was elected. It's 1992, baby. The Soviets are
The 90s.
dead.
Where are all
Bush,
my 90s
despite
kids?
overseeing the fall of the Soviet Union and bombing Saddam's forces back into Iraq,
In Kuwait,
still
yeah.
promised to not raise taxes.
Read
My lips.
And then he raised taxes.
No more taxes. Yeah.
So he was voted out. NATO was seen as a relic of an age that no longer existed. It was an active discussion in the 90s what the fate of NATO should even be. It was a stringently anti-communist alliance that no longer had a communism to fight. And yet,
It's kind of NATO's bad for pushing Russia away. Russia tried to join NATO on multiple occasions, but were refused. I honestly would have to read more on that. Maybe he's gonna mention it. I get it, you know.
NATO state.
NATO
Now,
did
let me
push
take out this big old
Russia
button.
away, but but of course we have this point, right?
I should iterate that the Russians are not simply victims in this. For Central Europe, nations like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and even other nations like the Baltic states.
It must have been strange for someone born during the Cold War to look at a map after 1991 and seeing all these new independent nations. True, there's no more Soviet Union anymore, no more Yugoslavia, and I'm sure there's others I'm forgetting.
Were living
Sudan,
under
maybe,
Soviet
kind of?
control for
don't know.
decades. As soon as the Warsaw Pact fell, there was a real home.
The 90s were walky for East and West.
Or at
True,
least get
though.
some protection from the West in case anything happened again. Would anything happen again? Who knows? The West didn't know, the Russians didn't know, and this was kind of the basis of Clinton sort of keeping NATO around. We're into 1993. Russia is
Pablo
slowly
Escobar.
rebuilding, with a few hiccups along the way. Clinton comes to Boris Yeltsin with a proposal, a partnership for peace. All of Europe now coming together. Nobody would need to expand NATO if we all were just in this partnership together. And then Clinton drops the bombshell on Yeltsin. This whole partnership for peace was not an alternative to the expansion of NATO. It was a preparation for it. To which Yeltsin replied, why? NATO was created in Cold War times. Today it's trying to find its place in Europe, not without difficulty. It's important that this search not create new divisions, but promote European unity. We believe that the plans of expanding NATO are contrary to this logic. Why sow the seeds of distrust? After all, we're no longer adversaries. We are partners. Yet the plans continued. Poland, Hungary, and Czechia soon joined NATO. Yet this wasn't the breaking point in relations. Russia still remained a part of the NATO cooperation sphere. There was an optimistic view that the kinks in this whole thing were slowly being worked out. Now, keep in mind, this whole time, NATO is entirely justified in what they're doing. They're technically not doing anything wrong. But from the Russian mindset, going from a communist superpower to a mafia state, where this man is their leader, well, they felt nothing but shame.
If China gets their way, they would backstab Russia and make them their puppet. I think that's what probably China would do.
That fear and paranoia
maybe that's
only
their
began
plan,
to
I don't know.
grow, and it became manifested when this guy came to power. But even with Putin in office and him winning the presidency through some zany means, Russia was still somewhat friendly with the US. Yet that was going to change.
All right.
In 2004, NATO, under Bush's push, brought in 7 new nations. Now, once again, if these nations wanted to join NATO, that's fine. But after a decade of this, Russia became paranoid that NATO was simply out to get them. And then Bush welcomes in these nations as escaping an evil empire.
The door to NATO will remain open until the whole of Europe is united in freedom and in peace.
You can even go back to
The
articles
whole
in
of
2004
Europe.
where
That
people
includes
say
Russia, though. I think NATO maybe wasn't the best at handling the situation, but at the same time, Russia was hard on cooperating, especially under Putin, you know. Friends by circumstance, true. China and Russia, friends by circumstance. What a story, man.
The Russian Duma began
Pretty interesting.
freaking out, and the first man they ran to was a violent Putin. Georgia was invaded 4 years later.
That's true. I agree with that. Trump said something I agree with, which is that Russia needs China's money and China needs Russian materials. So oil, gas, probably more things that I'm not thinking straight. I think Russia produces steels, right?
Keep in mind
Steel
when I
and-
say Russians, I don't mean all Russians. I mean the Russian government, which should usually be clear, but I just know some of you are going to try to use that as a gotcha. One question may be on your mind. After the Cold War, why didn't the Russians just join NATO if they were so afraid of it? General opposition to the West, for one. Russia, even while the USSR was collapsing, didn't want to view this as a defeat. They wanted to view this as a new age. Then it turns out only their institutions fell. But there's also another reason why Russia didn't join. NATO is not simply an alliance, it's a structured machine. When a nation joins NATO, it is not simply changing to the blue team. The way its military is organized becomes based around being able to work within that machine. A country joining NATO is a process that takes years. This isn't a process that simply happens. For one, a nation joining NATO has to be unanimously accepted by everyone. And it also has to be voted on by that nation's population. As an example, Hungary in 1997 voted 85% in favor of joining. Would the Russian people ever have accepted to join an organization that they believed was an arm of the American Empire?
No.
The rule of geopolitics is the closer you are to a superpower, the more they mingle and try to control your nation. And that's what Russia really views a lot of their neighbors as. Just pawns on a board for which they, as the stronger nation, have the right.
And that's the problem with Ukraine right there. People probably started seeing a bad change in Russia when they invaded Chechnya and Georgia. True.
Control.
That happened like
Their
in
goals
2008,
Europe
right?
Simply drive others away from them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. NATO expansion closer to Russia only made them more paranoid and isolated. However, if NATO didn't expand, who's to say what countries like Estonia might find themselves in right now?
Yeah.
It's clear Putin has some fantasy about rebuilding the Russian Empire, or at least the influence of the USSR. This video is not about two equally bad camps. NATO's greatest sin, at least in this regard, is leaving its doors wide open. It's been said that Americans should imagine what it'd be like if Canada fell to Chinese influence. Complaining that your geopolitical rival lied about letting your former allies into their compass club doesn't make you look like a victim. Nobody would feel sorry for the United States if China took Canada. They would laugh. Oh wait, actually we don't need a hypothetical. The same situation happened with the US too, with Cuba. And we know how the US would react when a neighbor turns to the enemy's side.
I agree with that.
Keep them sanctioned for decades, which, here's a little tip, is a bad thing to do too. Whataboutism is used a lot by pro-Putin supporters, bringing up every transgression the US has ever done.
Oh yeah, I fucking hate that.
And it's true the United States has done a lot of bad things.
That's a really bad
Iraq,
argument.
for instance, that was bad. It's funny it's being used as an equivalent because people in the West at the time protested the war without disappearing. The closest the US had to censoring opposition to the Iraq war was when the country industry killed off the Dixie Chick's career. Can Russians today say the same thing? Or are they not even allowed to call this a war but a military operation? That said, we should be asking some questions to ourselves.
It's true though.
Did NATO still need...
I think China would steal Siberia because Russia doesn't have the resources or population. I think that'd be a pretty big move. I don't think they would do that. China tends to act a little bit more quietly than Russia. But that'd be an interesting scenario. Guys, we're 17 viewers.
After the Soviets
Let's
fell.
go, man.
Did
Thank
NATO
y'all so
existing
much.
push Russia towards a nationalistic paranoia in its reforming years that undermined the same liberal democracy that the West was trying to plant within the country? Was NATO obligated to give Russian interests the time of day? Do geopolitics even work like that? For my personal opinion, I believe that the Russians had far different expectations for what a post-Soviet world would look like. The Russians believed, in part because of those 1990 talks involving East Germany, that with the end of the Warsaw Pact, NATO wouldn't expand. That instead, there would be some coalition in Europe where Russia has special...
Did you see that there are Syrians going to Ukraine to help Putin? As a reaction, people across the world going to help Ukraine. I heard that. I heard that both Putin is asking for fighters or for volunteers, and that a lot of people from the Middle East, particularly Syria, were joining Russia. Nukes are still a thing, so China will stay away. That's true. That's, you know, nukes are
While
a thing.
To the Americans, they
and
took
Russia
the
has a
fall
lot
of
of
the
nukes.
USSR as a victory. Their promises to the Soviets were when the Warsaw Pact still existed. With the collapse, the Americans now oversaw a Central and Eastern Europe that was eager to join in the economic prosperity of the West. It was a complicated act balancing these nations while also trying to not exclude the Russians. A Europe that Russia claimed it wanted to be in. Yet Russia only became more and more isolated. While much of this discussion is around NATO, this is simply one element. NATO, up until recent events, didn't actually move their military equipment past those original 1991 borders.
Kinda
The
true,
main
though.
issue the Russian government has isn't just a military.
Until recent events, and that's why we've gotten a lot of news. NATO's military is moving into Poland, or just in
bloc,
general,
but
you know.
Western institutions, or at least institutions that don't serve their interests. If Putin wasn't blaming
Oligarchs.
NATO, the problem would be something else. Like, I don't know, the whole thing that started this in the first place. Like Ukrainians wanting to join the European Union. Putin's Russia really has been their own worst enemy for a while, as every hostile action, every threat, every influence, every corrupt politician has only made their former allies turn against them.
Yep.
It's always good to try to see from all perspectives, yet not all perspectives are equal. Sometimes the perspective is simply that another nation was a mistake to exist. Sometimes it's that the collapse of the USSR was the most catastrophic event of the 20th century. Even if there was a kernel of truth to the idea that NATO misled the Russians, it does not justify their
Bruh, Bill
actions.
Clinton.
Should Putin really be talking about how misleading is bad? Kind of seems like that was their strategy for the last few months.
Would Cuba send people for Russia? I don't think so. You know, there will be other countries that would have sent. I don't think that Cuba or Venezuela and other countries allied to Russia want to make the US and the West angry. You know, the Russian sanctions have been pretty brutal. So I don't think Cuba or Venezuela need more sanctions, you know?
NATO is not a perfect organization. However, if the nations of Europe want to join this club, it should always be their right. Russia expected the continent to remain a neutral ground for their own interests, even after their pact collapsed. And when that didn't happen, they claimed no fair. You do not start wars over verbal agreements that happened before most of your troops were even born. We cannot forget that this all
Yeah.
is coming down to a real war within a split nation. A war that, while true has been raging for 8 years, only began because the Russian side didn't have their guy in charge anymore. One that escalated into an invasion of an independent nation, which regardless
Independent
of the
nation.
justification, only justifies the fears of Russia's enemies. So, yeah, congrats Putin. You were the monster that proved NATO was right to build up. While this alliance didn't know what it was going to be in the mid-90s, it sure does know now. You didn't want to be a part of Europe, and now you get your wish.
Yikes. Holy shit. With Russia shrinking, aging population, and large numbers of people emigrating out of the country, I wonder if Putin worries that they might not be able to maintain their nukes. Possibly true. I definitely think that the shrinking population had something to do with Putin making the decision right now, you know? It's now or never, basically. The more their population ages, the smaller their military gets, the smaller their economy gets. It's just a big problem that they can ask Japan, that it really hits hard. There's talks of taking Russian oligarch homes in London and not allowing Ukrainian refugees to live in them for a while. And allowing Ukrainian refugees to live for a while. That's pretty funny. You know, I could see that. I don't know how easy or complicated that would be, but you know, it's a fun little way to punish Putin and his allies, because you know he's friends with a lot of oligarchs. So can you blame him? I don't support American sanctions on Russia. It's just making the current gas crisis even worse. I agree. Especially, I've heard that in America, gas prices are being pretty bad, you know, pretty high. But I don't know, man. You can't just sit and watch, you know? If there's no sanctions, basically America would be sitting and watching while Ukraine gets pummeled. And the sanctions, I know they're pretty rough on the American people and the American people's wallets, but they are being so much more devastating on Russia. And I'm sure that they're soon gonna surrender or make peace with Ukraine or back down, and it's gonna work. I really think it's gonna work. 15 viewers, guys. Should we watch another video?